What happens when justice doesn't come from the courts but from the soil itself? Why did 12 enslaved men choose silence after burying their tormentor alive? And why, more than 160 years later, does no grass grow where his body lies? This isn't just a ghost story. It's a forgotten chapter of American history, buried beneath blood, silence, and symbols. If you want real stories that defy time and uncover hidden truths, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. Some nights, the wind across the Westcott fields doesn't sound like wind at all. It sounds like something buried deep is still trying to speak. In the spring of 2025, Dr. Miriam Lane, a quiet but relentless researcher, arrived in Franklin Parish, Louisiana. She wasn't chasing hauntings. Her work focused on erased black narratives of the 19th century. But this story wasn't about ghosts. It was about silence. A silence so deliberate, it rang louder than any legend. The silence of Westcott Hall. The plantation itself no longer stood. Only foundations choked with weeds and a single leaning outbuilding remained, long misidentified as a tool shed. Local Siouam. Records claimed the house burned in 1863 under unclear circumstances. Miriam had seen that phrase before. It was almost always code for something unspeakable. The land's current owner, an elderly man, refused to step foot near it. But he gave Miriam the rusted iron key with trembling hands. His only words were a warning whispered like a prayer. Don't go under the floor. What's dead under there don't sleep right. Inside the shed, the air was heavy with mildew and rot. Dust turned to sludge in the corners where rain had leaked through the roof. Yet Miriam's trained eye caught a detail others would have missed. A faint seam in the wallboards, shoulder height, too precise to be natural. She wedged her crowbar into the crack and pulled. The panel gave way, revealing a hidden cavity. Inside lay a bundle of fabric wrapped in decayed oilskin. It crumbled at her touch. Within it was a leather-bound journal, warped with age, its pages fragile but still readable. It bore no name, no greeting, only a single chilling line at the top of the first page. He screams still. I hear him clawing at the earth beneath us. Miriam's throat tightened. What followed was a strange, fragmented account, part confession, part diary. The handwriting was elegant, careful. Names appeared but were veiled. A man referred to only as JB, beat people for pleasure. A group of 12 were mentioned, their names deliberately scratched out. Pages were missing, others stained with something that might have been rust or blood. Miriam copied and encrypted the text immediately. Days later, she uploaded a cryptic video to her anonymous history vlog, reading aloud only fragments. One phrase repeated 7 times throughout the journal. The 13th night is when the ground remembers. Viewers speculated wildly. Some said it was code, others mocked it as a hoax. But among the noise, one comment stood out. It came from an account with no uploads, no profile picture, only a string of numbers, 12631863. The message was short. He was never hanged. He was buried. Find the stone where the cane won't grow. 2 nights later, Miriam returned. She carried ground-penetrating radar and a permit for archaeological scans. She laid out her equipment across the rotting floorboards. That's when she noticed it. Shallow indentations etched into the wood beneath her feet. Symbols nearly erased by time. Miriam didn't sleep that night, not from fear, but from the deep, electric hum of revelation. Something had been hidden. Here, not just a man's fate, but a choice, a decision that was deliberate, ritualistic, and final. Somehow, impossibly, the earth still remembered. He hadn't commanded respect, he demanded fear, and where fear faltered, he replaced it with the whip. In 1863, the Westcott plantation was a swollen scar across the Louisiana countryside, its cotton fields stretching endlessly beneath a sun that punished the living. The Civil War raged beyond the horizon, but here time moved according to other laws, measured not in hours or battles, but in lashings, footsteps, and silence. It was in that silence that Josiah Brant thrived. Brant wasn't a landowner. He was worse, a man with no stake, no lineage, and nothing to lose. Born an orphan in the Appalachian backwoods, he came south not for prosperity but for dominion. By 30, he had carved his name into infamy as an overseer whose methods were brutal even by the merciless standards of the age. Word spread that he didn't discipline for profit or order, but for pleasure. He carried a custom whip, its tip braided with copper wire. When it struck, it didn't crack like leather. It sang, piercing, unnatural. Some whispered he soaked it in salt water between uses. Others said he'd given it a name, though no one dared ask what it was. Brant's reign wasn't about control. It was about sport. He invented punishments that masqueraded as choices. A boy who spilled a bucket of water might be told to kneel on broken glass or dig his own grave just to see how deep it would go. No matter the choice, pain was the outcome. The plantation's owner, Reginald Westcott, old and failing, turned a blind eye. Brant was efficient, and efficiency meant profit. But even Westcott admitted in private that something was wrong in the man's eyes. He never drank, never gambled, never chased women. He simply watched, and waited, and inflicted. Among the enslaved, there existed a fragile code of endurance, a language of resilience passed quietly through glances, songs hummed under breath, gestures made behind Brant's back. But hope had worn thin, until Elijah arrived. He came in February, a new laborer, with a bearing unlike the others. He didn't drop his gaze. He worked with steady precision, but carried himself with the weight of someone who had once been free. Strange scars marked his palms and neck, circular, deliberate, as though burned into him by heated rings. No one knew where he had come from. Brant noticed him immediately. He tried every cruelty to break him. Public lashings, withheld food, forced isolation. But Elijah endured. And then one day, after a strike across his back, Elijah looked Brant in the eye and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The earth takes back what's been stolen." From that moment something shifted. 12 others began to gather in silence, not with words, but with looks. A rhythm formed between them, a breath held in unison. Among them was a cook, a field hand, even a boy of 13. Quietly, they began carving symbols, on bark, on scraps of cloth, on stone. Each mark carried the same shape, the same intention. Brant never noticed. Or perhaps he did, and simply didn't understand. Then the animals began to change. The dogs were first. They stopped barking near the quarters. Then the birds stopped nesting in the sugarcane. At night, the wind no longer moved through the trees, as if the plantation itself had begun to hold its breath. One evening, Josiah Brant walked into the slave quarters alone, whip in hand. Why, no one knew. Some claimed he was hunting a runaway, who never existed. Others whispered he was following a sound only he could hear. He never came back. For 12 nights, the field stood silent. Not all disappearances happen in a flash. Some sink slowly, like a stone swallowed by thick mud. The night Josiah Brant vanished became one of those nights Southern folklore never forgets. The moon rose swollen and rust-colored, hanging in the sky like an open wound. Old women murmured that such moons marked the thinning of the veil between worlds, a time when the dead could speak, and the living were wise to stay quiet. By morning, March 13th, 1863, Brant was gone. No alarms were raised, no blood was found. His whip had vanished. His boots, always left with military precision outside his door, stood untouched. It was Miss Reba, an elderly woman known for her second sight, who first voiced what others only feared to think aloud. "He ain't been taken, he's been claimed." The white overseers, terrified of revolt, stormed the quarters with rifles. They demanded answers. No one spoke, but behind the eyes of the 12 who had gathered in secret, there was no fear, only calm. The kind of calm that comes not before terror, but after it. Within days, their behavior shifted. Each of the 12 stopped speaking altogether. They obeyed commands, endured punishments, but answered no questions. In silence, they began crafting small objects in secret, carved stones, bundles of twine, figures scratched into the dirt in repeating patterns. Each symbol was burned or buried before sunrise. The same patterns Miriam Lane would uncover more than a century and a half later beneath her own feet. Then, one by one, the 12 began to die, not by lash, not by bullet, by something deliberate. Sarah, the plantation cook, was found seated upright beside her fire, eyes wide open, hands folded in her lap. The stable boy, Isaac, collapsed in the fields, lips tinged blue, a bitter scent clinging to his breath. A hidden cache of foxglove and oleander was discovered later, carefully measured, precisely stored. By the end of the 13th night, all 12 were gone. Doctors called it poisoning, collective and unexplained. Plantation owner Reginald Westcott ordered the quarters burned and the ground fumigated. What he never reported, but what his granddaughter discovered decades later in a letter hidden in an attic trunk, was what the workers found while clearing the ashes. Beneath the floorboards, there had been a cavity, deep, squared at the edges, its walls lined with hand-hewn wood, still damp, still gouged with claw marks. In the splintered timbers were fragments of fingernail, tufts of dark hair, threads of copper filament, like the braided tip of a whip. But there was no body around. The cavity, arranged in a perfect circle, were 12 carved stones. Each bore a symbol, an impossible fusion of African tribal markings and obscure Christian iconography. They were not placed at random. They had been set ritually. Westcott ordered the pit filled and the floor sealed with pitch. He told no one. Within a year, he abandoned Louisiana under the guise of illness, dying alone in upstate New York. What remained was a story too terrible to tell, yet too dangerous to forget. For decades afterward, locals avoided the land. Crops failed on a single patch of soil. Children who trespassed returned mute, their eyes wide with things they could not describe. Surveyors complained of compasses spinning wildly, tools that rusted overnight. No animals burrowed there. Even birds veered away, as if obeying an instinct older than memory. And still, from time to time, someone swore they heard it. A low, steady scratching beneath the ground. Faint, desperate, rhythmic, as if something, or someone, was still trying to dig their way out. Justice does not always wear robes. Sometimes it comes in calloused hands and the hush of midnight soil. The fate of Josiah Brandt was never meant for the record books. It survived instead as a whispered inheritance, passed quietly from fire to fire, from lips to ears, in the hush of Louisiana nights. No official archive could capture what happened beneath the beams of the old Senzala. But fragments, stories, symbols, and dream journals suggest one truth. Josiah Brandt was not merely killed, he was buried alive. The 12 men who orchestrated Josiah Brandt's disappearance had not acted on impulse. They had prepared in silence for weeks. The symbols they carved into bark and stone were not random scratches. They were sigils, borrowed from West African spiritual systems, early Christian rites of exorcism, and fragments of folk customs whispered among enslaved communities. This was not vengeance. This was precision. On the night of Brandt's entombment, the air was heavy with stormless humidity. No owls called, no frogs sang. It was as if the earth itself had stopped to listen. Lured into the quarters under false pretenses, Brandt was struck, not fatally, but with cruel efficiency. He was bound with cords soaked in oxblood, blindfolded, gagged with strips of his own shirt, and dragged across the dirt floor. The pit was ready, 6 feet deep, lined with stones, its base softened with ash and moss. At each of 12 corners lay a talisman, each marked with a drop of blood from one of the 12 men. Brandt was lowered into the cavity not carelessly, but with ritual. Each man circled once in silence. Words had already been written on a strip of parchment, set aflame, and dropped into the pit before the burial began. They did not use shovels. They used their hands. For hours, they passed earth in silence, covering him slowly. Brandt's muffled screams did not rise. They sank, growing lower, as if drawn downward into the soil itself. One by one, each man spat into the earth, turned, and sat in a wide circle around the fresh grave. They stayed until dawn, heads bowed. Then they rose and went about their work as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. In the days that followed, the 12 began to show signs of transformation. Some hummed a melody no one recognized. One carved a spiral into his own forearm. Another drew flowers on the kitchen hearth in ash, each bloom hiding strange symbols within its petals. None smiled. None wept. And then, methodically, they began to die. Scholars later argued it had not been an execution at all, but a binding. Brant was not simply killed. He was sealed, contained. A force that took pleasure in suffering could not be allowed to pass freely into death. It had to be pinned, locked in flesh, earth, and silence. The whip was never recovered. Not until 1923. That year, during a drought that cracked the fields and exposed ancient roots, a child stumbled across a strange object protruding from the soil near the ruins of the Senzala. It was the handle of a whip, bound in cracked leather, its copper-tipped end corroded but unmistakable. The moment he touched it, his hands blistered. That night, he fell into fever and whispered in a language no one recognized. By morning, his grandmother had buried the whip beneath a stone carved with 12 notches. She never told where. Years passed. The story dimmed. Until Miriam Lane. Her research revealed that the symbols carved into Westcott's foundation matched those in obscure texts. Rituals designed not to punish, not to avenge, but to trap something inhuman inside the body of a man. Rituals that only worked if the sacrifice remained alive and aware. Some graves are not meant to be opened. Others were never fully closed. It was the final entry in the journal that shifted everything. After months decoding fragments and aligning symbols across the ruins, Miriam returned one last time, just before dawn. She carried ground-penetrating radar, a portable spectrometer, and a grainy photocopy of the last line ever written in the Baun diary. If the 13th night breaks the seal, may no soul be near to hear him rise. The Senzala was long gone, absorbed by the earth. What lingered was the atmosphere, a pressure in the air that clung like wet linen. Instruments malfunctioned. Animals refused to cross the site. And in town, the old men who still remembered their grandmother's whispers warned her not to return. They never explained. They didn't need to. Marking the site's center from surviving schematics, Miriam swept the soil. The radar revealed irregularities, subtle depressions, unnatural patterns. At the precise heart of the ruins lay a hollow space. Rectangular, 7 feet deep, its walls bordered by stone, possibly wood. Soil samples showed abnormal traces of copper and hematin, a compound found in decayed blood. No bones appeared, but buried directly above the void was a metallic object, cylindrical, wrapped in deteriorated cloth. The whip. Miriam didn't touch it. She photographed everything, logged the coordinates, and returned to her rented cottage to process the data. That evening, she uploaded a password-protected video to her private channel. The video contained only one image, the whip, half exposed, encircled by 12 stones. 12 stones. 12 notches. 12 deaths. Days later, Miriam stopped responding to messages. Subscribers speculated wildly, threats, cover-ups, curses. Some claimed they had downloaded the video before it vanished, but every copy failed to play. Metadata revealed a single corrupt timestamp, 13-13-13. A week later, a ranger patrolling the site reported a collapse where the Senzala once stood, a sinkhole. At its edges were claw-like impressions in the soil. Inside, no prints, no wildlife, no vandalism. Only fine ash and a perfect ring of salt. Miriam Lane was never seen again. Months later, hikers discovered a weathered slab of stone deep in the woods. It bore no writing, only a single symbol, identical to the ones Miriam had deciphered. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the cracked lens of her camera. Nothing else. Today, Westcott Plantation remains unmarked. Most locals refuse to speak of it. But some nights, especially when the moon bleeds red across the fields, Witnesses swear they hear it. A scrape, a breath, a low, ragged voice, still trying to claw its way through the soil.